a debate has been around for decades, and most people who debate who is better between these two entities are kind of the same types of people. People who appreciate music from the 1960s, whether because they grew up in it or they just come to appreciate it. My and the fact is, the people in this debate are not enemies in real life. There is no hostility necessarily. There are connections between them, certainly, and that is the connection between my favorite lyricist and hero, Bob Dylan, and the Beatles. Who is better? Who was the better entity, the better lyricist? Bob Dylan is at, kind of a disadvantage because he's one person, but you could also say that gives him an advantage. But we all know the history. We know that the Traveling Wilburys in the late 80s featured Harrison and Dylan. We know that there's, of course, the famous clip of Dylan and Lennon from the documentary, Eat the Document, which was, I believe it was released in 1966, but filmed in 1965. It was, of course, in Europe, England, of course, home of the Beatles, of Lennon and Dylan, definitely both under the influence of some sort of substance, in a limousine, or a taxi, I believe limousine. Of course, the clip's all over YouTube. And he has connections with McCartney and Starr performing with them, and etc. And of course, the famous story of Dylan introducing the Beatles to marijuana in 1964. But in my opinion, Bob Dylan, my hero, my favorite lyricist, blows the Beatles out of the water. Through Bob Dylan, we see the story of America. We see the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, and his early albums, Bob Dylan in 62, Free Will and Bob Dylan in 63, Times They Are Changin' in 64. He was at the March on Washington. Then, of course, he moved into the more absurdist, wild lyrics of the mid-60s, influenced by the beatniks of the 50s. And then he kind of got out of the scene for a while and put out Nashville Skyline in 69 and kind of left and lived in Woodstock, and finally got back involved in things during the second great creative period in the mid-70s. And when he was going through his divorce, he had the release of Blood on the Tracks and the release of Planet Waves before that, and then in 76, Desire. And they were so much like his, in my opinion, greatest albums of the mid-60s, Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61 Revisited, and Blonde on Blonde. Then in the late 70s, you had the born-again Christian era of Dylan, and the early 80s. And then the 80s, the whole 80s, was, of course, kind of the era where he didn't fit. And I kind of think that that's because you had Reagan as president, and I'm not trying to be anti-Reagan. I have nothing against Ronald Reagan. But it was a conservative time, I think. Well, it was very pro-big business time for America in the 80s. Reaganism was going strong, big business was flourishing, and a lot of music wasn't lyrical. And Dylan didn't fit in the 80s. Every album he put out, only one song would be liked. Like Brownsville Girl on the Knocked Out Loaded album in 86, Silvio from Down in the Groove in 88. Then the Traveling Wilburys came in, he was big. Then Oh Mercy was very successful. Then he put out, Under the Red Sky in 90, which wasn't well liked, and World Gone Wrong, Good As I've Been to You in the early 90s. And then MTV Unplugged. And then the third great creative period, you could say, began with Time Out of Mind in 97, which won the Triple Grammy. And then, since then we've seen Love and Theft, Modern Times, Together Through Life, etc. And in my opinion, Dylan covers everything. Every bit of human emotion is covered in one of the songs at some period of time. I mean, he is the man. He's the greatest, to me. And the Beatles were big for a decade. And I don't claim to know that much about the Beatles or be some sort of Beatles historian. But they were great. But in my opinion, they didn't become great till after they were influenced by Dylan. And I will admit Dylan was influenced by the Beatniks, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. And they were the first ones with their crazy poetry in the 50s and the drugs and driving around and doing all of that. But in my opinion, the Beatles couldn't have been who they were if it wasn't for Dylan. Dylan was better. Dylan is 69 years old and still active. And sadly, Lennon has been dead for 30 years. And I'm not saying that's good. That's horrible, but it's true. Harrison's been dead for 9. Harrison is my favorite of all the Beatles. Of course, McCartney and Starr still alive, still around, still active. But at least I think Starr is. I'm almost certain McCartney is. So that to me is why Robert Allen Zimmerman, a little Jewish boy from Duluth, Minnesota, is the greatest lyricist ever. And better than the Beatles. With all due respect to Beatles fans.